Hello, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to spend a little time learning about redistricting, reapportionment, and gerrymandering. If you're like most folks, you've probably heard these words, but may not understand what they mean and why they're so important to the way our government functions in terms of representing us. As we like to say, gerrymandering may not be the issue you care about most, it's just the issue you need to care about first. So to start with, we need to understand two terms, and the first of them is reapportionment. The U.S. Constitution requires that the 435 seats in the House of Representatives, or Congress, be apportioned to states according to population count. Now, each state decides the process for congressional redistricting, and following every national census, the distribution of those seats is subject to change based on population changes over the past decade. Over the last two redistricting cycles, Pennsylvania has lost 2 congressional seats because our population is not growing as fast as other parts of the country. Less than 100 years ago, our congressional delegation was 36. States are tasked with drawing lines for both the U.S. congressional and state House and Senate districts. Pennsylvania has a separate and distinct process for redrawing congressional and state legislative districts. And the second term is redistricting, the process of redrawing the boundaries of legislative districts here in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has 2 procedures for redistricting. Congressional redistricting in Pennsylvania is done through the regular legislative process. A bill defining district boundaries is drawn up and passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the governor. Problem is, Pennsylvania law doesn't say how congressional districts should be redrawn, or what criteria should be used to ensure new district boundaries are fair. If the legislature and the governor belong to the same party, that party can end up with exclusive control over the result. Legislators often don't see proposed maps much before they're voted upon. Maps for our 203 state House seats and 50 Senate seats are drawn by a Legislative Redistricting Commission, or LRC, and that is created under the rules in our state constitution. The Pennsylvania Constitution requires 50 state Senate seats and 203 state House seats that are composed of compact and contiguous territory as nearly equal in population as practicable. And unless absolutely necessary, no county, city, incorporated town, borough, township, or ward shall be divided in forming either a senatorial or representative district. Now, this requirement has often been ignored in order to benefit the party in control of the mapping process. This might seem pretty straightforward, but gerrymandering is drawing voting district boundaries to benefit a party or a candidate. The name was coined in 1812 when Massachusetts Governor Eldridge Gerry, or Gary, approved a bill that drew districts favoring his party. Critics said it resembled the shape of a monstrous salamander, and they mashed it up with Jerry and salamander and came up with the term gerrymander. Important issues critical to Pennsylvania residents receive lip service every election cycle, but no real action. Because of gerrymandering, our ability to replace legislators and to change the majority party at the ballot box in either direction is undermined. Critical issues are ignored, starting with property tax reform and going nowhere, equitable school funding, roads, highways, and bridges, funding for testing for lead in children, limits to PAC campaign funding, and redistricting reform. Pick your issue. It's a good chance that it probably has gone into the legislature and not come out. In fact, over the last 10 years, less than 10% of proposed bills were enacted. For those of you who may not fully understand the term, here's a quick primer on how to gerrymander. Now, on the left-hand side, if you have a certain number of units, you can divide them in different ways to get different results. If your population is 60% blue and 40% red, you can divide them this way. And you can get a perfect representation. Blue gets 3 districts and red gets 2 districts. If you divide the units a different way, blue gets all the representation and red gets no representation. Or if the reds are drawing the lines, the units can be divided in such a way that the minority party could actually end up with the majority representation. So that's gerrymandering in a nutshell. Both parties have and will gerrymander if they can. Lawsuits aren't the answer. Elected judges drawing maps behind closed doors lacks transparency. In 2010, Republicans controlled all three branches of government, a trifecta for gerrymandering. Democrats today hold a single vote majority in the House, and Republicans control the Senate. For 2031, we don't know who will be in the governor's office or in the majority in either chamber. We do know that whoever wins will try and gerrymander to cement that control for the next cycle. If Democrats control the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they will most likely control state legislative district redistricting, as the Pennsylvania Supreme Court will choose the chair of the LRC and could wind up choosing final maps in a legal dispute. That's why the Supreme Court election this fall looms so large. On the left is the old Pennsylvania 7th Congressional District, drawn by Republicans, known as Goofy Kicking Donald. It was so carefully drawn that one of the connectors between segments was the parking lot of a seafood restaurant. But lest you think the fault is all with Republicans, consider this. Maryland's 3rd Congressional District, drawn by Democrats during the same time period, this highly inventive map eliminated one Republican congressperson, connected major media markets to advantage Democrats' incumbents, and as one observer said, to get to all parts of it, you needed a kayak. In Pennsylvania, where the redistricting process has been controlled by Republicans, counties, municipalities, and even wards were cracked to dilute the Democratic vote into the surrounding Republican areas. The pie charts on this slide provide a snapshot of the problem with the 2011 congressional maps in Pennsylvania. In the 2016 congressional elections using those maps, slightly more votes were cast for Republicans than for Democrats, so you'd expect the congressional delegation would have been slightly more Republican than Democrat. Yet somehow, Republicans won 13 of the congressional seats. We saw the same scenario in 2012 and 2014. The 13-5 delegation was baked in by the map. A lawsuit led to a court ruling that Pennsylvania's 2011 congressional maps were unconstitutional, and in time for the 2018 midterm elections, they were redrawn by the court. You can see the difference in the earlier Goofy Donald District number 7. In 2018, 54% of the votes were cast for Democratic candidates, and Democrats and Republicans each won 9 of the 18 seats. Maps matter. The congressional delegation was no longer baked in. Because the legislature and the governor could not agree on a congressional map in 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was again responsible for selecting a map. The court chose a map that was very similar to the one they'd drawn in 2018, minus one district. This map turned out to be a very responsive one to voter sentiment. In 2022, Democrats won a bit more than 50% of the vote in statewide elections, and the delegation was evenly split between the parties. In 2024, Republicans won a bit more than 50% of the vote in statewide elections, and the delegation shifted to a 10 Republican and 7 Democrat split. We should all be celebrating a map that's responsive to the will of the voters. However, our celebration is short-lived because the process for redrawing the congressional lines has not been fixed. Whoever's in the majority the next time around will do everything they can to manipulate the congressional lines to bake in a delegation that favors their party for the next decade. The court also did nothing to address how state legislative districts are drawn. That process is delegated by our Constitution to a Legislative Reapportionment Commission, or LRC. The LRC includes the 4 leaders of the legislature, the majority and minority leaders of both chambers. They're supposed to choose a chair to break ties, and if they can't do so, which has happened more and more often, the state Supreme Court does so. If the court chooses a partisan chair, then the maps are drawn by 3 people. So are these maps approved or reviewed by the full legislature? No. By the governor? No. The public? No. The existing constitutional mandate for the LRC is flawed and has resulted in a long history of gerrymandering enabled by the selection of partisan chairs. However, the 2021 cycle was in many ways unique. The court this time picked a chair lauded by both parties. He was fair, he was transparent, he encouraged public input, including suggestions for maps. He held hearings across the state that were televised and recorded. Public attention and engagement was very high. Now, some said, hey, this works. We don't need to change the law, but they were wrong. The law is, and the legislators' participation was, as flawed as ever. During the last redistricting in 2021, House Speaker Joanna McClinton, a Democrat, and Senate Leader Kerry Benningoff, a Republican, didn't talk to each other. As a result, direct negotiations soon stopped, and to keep things moving, the chair met with leaders separately. Since the chair met with each House leader separately, there was no quorum, which would have required public meetings. The commission staff ended up drawing a map that has resulted in a 102 Democrat, 101 Republican state house for the past 2 cycles. 3 elections were won by Democrats in very close elections, so it was completely unknown who will control the majority in the next session or in 2031. While some Republicans have claimed that the House map favors Democrats, note that Jonathan Service, who drew the map for the state, also drew the New York congressional maps after a Democratic gerrymander was struck down there. Those maps gave Republicans a majority in Congress in the 2022 elections. So if you made partisans from both parties mad, you probably did a fair job. The public hearings and info shared on the LRC website were thanks to the LRC chair and staff, not the legislators. But the end results were maps that were not dictated by party leaders, thanks to the LRC chair and staff. On the Senate side, the 2 leaders, Republican Kim Ward and Democrat Jay Costa, attended initial meetings, but they then began discussing issues and negotiating between themselves, according to the chair's report. The chair did act as a moderator when asked, but the final map was dictated by leaders and not the full group. That was what we call a buddy-mander. That's when party leaders agree to protect incumbents on each side, sort of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours scenario. Since 2018, we've had more responsive congressional maps. For this decade, the congressional delegation is not baked in by a map, but the problem has not been solved, and we're still here, and we're staying here because the process that allowed party leaders to create Goofy kicking Donald remains in place. The process is the problem. To fix the problem, we have to fix the process. The fix is an independent redistricting commission. So what do we mean when we talk about an independent commission? We mean a commission representative of the Commonwealth's diversity and free from legislative influence in both the selection of commission members and operation of the commission. We want a transparent public process that includes public hearings, sharing of information about redistricting proposals, and equal access to all data information for both the public and commissioners. We want prioritized mapping standards that are clear, measurable, and promote equitable representation for counties, municipalities, and communities of interest, with defined limits on population deviation and attention to compactness, contiguity, and geographic boundaries. Co-sponsor memos are being circulated for companion bills HB 131 and Senate Bill 131. These bills are updated versions of the 2023-24 legislation and incorporate feedback from allied organizations, legislators, and lessons learned from other states. The prime sponsors of the bills are Steve Samuelson, Mark Gillen, and Tim Carney. Co-sponsor memos go out to all members of the House and Senate and encourage each one of them to sign on as co-sponsor, indicating they support the idea. At this time, we have 50 House members signed on as co-sponsors. 102 would be enough for a majority in support of passage. In the 2017-18 session, we had 110, but the bill never even got a vote. In the Senate, we have 18 co-sponsors out of 50 senators. We're now actively reaching out to legislators to urge their support, and that's where many of you can help, as I'll explain. We need you to pressure your legislators to support redistricting reform. Our bills propose a new way to handle the redistricting process, an independent citizens commission. And the obvious question is, how would that work? Well, it would include 11 members drawn from 3 pools of voters, 4 registered with the majority, 4 with the minority party, and 3 voters not registered with the major party. The process for citizens to apply would be widely publicized, and the applicants then vetted to choose those who meet the specified qualifications. The Department of State would select and screen for eligible candidates and then randomly draw 80 of those from each pool. The State Ethics Commission would select 60, 20 from each pool, based on skills, geographic, and demographic diversity. The 4 chamber leaders can strike 2 from each pool, and then a random drawing picks 2 from each pool, and the 6 chosen then pick the last 5 to ensure overall skills and diversity of members. So if you want to apply to be an IRC Commission member, what are the qualifications? Well, for party membership, you have to be registered or not registered with the party for at least 5 years. You have to have voted in that category in at least 2 of the last 3 statewide elections. Over the past 5 years, you cannot have been an office holder or candidate for office, a member of party governing body, a PAC or a campaign, employees, consultants, or close family members of the foregoing, or a registered lobbyist. You can't serve in any of these capacities for at least 5 years after IRC service, and you must reflect Pennsylvania's geographic, ethnic, racial, and gender diversity. We propose an open and transparent process. Commissioners will receive training and orientation in topics including, but not limited to, the Voting Rights Act, mapping tools, redistricting criteria, and effective redistricting processes from other states. That includes open meetings and processes, redistricting data, mapping technology, and all meeting transcripts and recordings will be accessible to the public on a free communications platform. Actions of the commissioners are to be held at widely publicized public meetings, at least 8 before the drawing of maps, and another 8 after the preliminary maps are made public. At least 4 of each must be held in Pennsylvania's 4 largest cities. Actions by the Commission shall be in a public meeting with affirmative votes of at least 7 commissioners, and it must include at least 2 commissioners from each pool for a vote to count. Pennsylvania open meeting laws apply, including restrictions on ex parte communications. The redistricting plan must follow U.S. Constitution, federal laws, and the Voting Rights Act. Any plan must also not unduly favor or disfavor incumbent or prospective candidates, nor can it provide an artificial advantage to any party on a statewide basis. A plan shall provide equal opportunity of representation for racial minorities. Districts may not split precincts and shall be drawn from the fewest number of divisions to counties, municipalities, and wards. A county may not contain more districts than the number required by the population, plus 1 for congressional or Senate districts and plus 2 for House districts. They must adhere to population deviation ranges, and they need to be contiguous, with exceptions for county or municipal fragments or enclaves containing less than 50 persons. To the extent possible, without violating the preceding criteria, districts shall be compact in form as determined through standard compactness measures, and district boundaries shall conform to existing natural boundaries. And as much as possible, they must respect communities of interest. We don't have an overabundance of time to get this done. You're thinking it's 2025, what's the rush? Well, the changes we seek require that the same bill be passed in 2 consecutive 2-year legislative sessions because it's an amendment to the Constitution. So right now we're in the 25-26 session. We need to pass this measure this session. That means it must be passed again with no changes in the next session in 27-28. If that happens, there has to be enough time for a statewide voter referendum to approve the amendment, which could happen in late 2028 or in 2029. But that must happen in a November election and not the spring primaries with low voter turnout. The June 2029 budget would have to include budgeting for commission and advertising for applicant screening, choosing, and training them. The census begins in 2030, and the work of the commission begins work in 2031. Doing all of this in Pennsylvania is very difficult. We've been trying since 2016, and legislative leaders do not want to lose their power to choose their voters and preserve that power, and they make sure the rules of the legislature give them total power to decide what bills get heard and voted on in each session. We have no petition and referendum process to force our bill before the voters, so how do we convince legislators to support this bill? There are two ways. Remind legislators, you don't know who will be in the majority in 2031. You don't know who will be in the governor's mansion. You know that whoever is in the majority will do everything they can to manipulate the lines to cement that majority for the next decade. Ask legislators, what happens to them if the other party controls the process? In our view, the best protection against being railroaded by the other party is an independent commission. We'll emphasize the balance and stability of our processes. That includes what I talked about before: commission independence, transparent public process, prioritize mapping standards. It is our and their best chance for a fair process. At Fair Districts, one of our mantras is the ABCs of redistricting. Maps drawn by Democrats are going to favor Democrats, those drawn by Republicans will favor Republicans, and maps drawn by citizens will favor citizens. So the obvious question is, why are we reaching out to as many Pennsylvanians as we can on this issue, and what can you do to help us? Well, the best place to start is our website, www.fairdistrictspa.com. At the site, you'll see a tab labeled Take Action. Click on that and sign our petition. So far, over 130,000 Pennsylvanians have already done so. We've gathered those online and by appearing at polling places, fairs, festivals, and community events to get them one by one. We'll ask you for your name and zip code, and that way we can determine who your state representatives and senators are, and when we go in to meet with them, we can say, we have hundreds or even thousands of your constituents who signed the petition saying they want independent redistricting. You can also sign up as a volunteer. Click the button at the top right of our homepage. We have several thousand active volunteers from all political persuasions across the state, and our efforts are fueled by their collective skills and interests, everything from database management to research, writing, photography, videography, and more. Legislators keep insisting we're using paid expertise, but in fact it's all volunteer. If you sign up, we have training videos for volunteers, and we'll put you in touch with local and regional Fair Districts volunteer groups you can work with and match your skills and interests with our needs. This next step is very important. You need to reach out to your legislators and tell them you support independent redistricting. The site will also help you find your legislators, their names and district numbers, and how you can contact them. You can get updates, including emails, and join monthly Zoom sessions with latest updates. And you can follow us on social media, including X, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also request a speaker on the website, just as your group did to arrange this meeting. I'm guessing that many of you are members of other groups and organizations that would be interested in learning about this important subject and why it's important to them. Just fill out the Request Speaker form on the Take Action page, and we'll assign a speaker, whether it's in person or online. You can write a letter to the editor. We have volunteers to help you do that and critique your drafts. You can also keep us up to date on media in your area that you know people listen, watch, and read, so we can make sure our message gets spread widely. You can call, write, or email your legislator and let them know you want them to support HB 31 and SB 131. If you're interested, we can add you to upcoming plan meetings with your legislator if they're in process. Having real constituents take part in such meetings is very powerful. You can join us for polling place outreach. We go out to polls during primaries and regular elections, and we need volunteers to man tables to educate voters and get them to sign our petition. You can also help with community tabling events. We go to fairs, festivals, and other events also to gather constituent signatures to help add to the numbers that we've collected so far. Our present system leaves dozens of issues critical to the citizens of Pennsylvania in limbo. Brought up year after year, many never get votes. We write around 4,000 bills every 2-year session. We pass fewer than 300 with one of the largest and best paid legislators in the country. Whether it's fair school funding, environmental safety legacies due to weak regulation, lead in our buildings and drinking water, fire and EMS shortages, bans on legislator gifts, failing state hospitals and access to local health care, especially in rural areas, greater legislative transparency, and fair rules that allow bills with strong support to get hearings and votes of strength. Most do not get votes. So you look at a list like that and you think, why do so many bills with broad support go nowhere year after year in Harrisburg? Well, in 2018, Fair District sponsored a forum on redistricting reform in Harrisburg, and one of the speakers was Pennsylvania Representative Steve Samuelson, a Democrat. Samuelson, along with a Republican, was a co-sponsor of House Bill 722. That was the first redistricting bill we filed for reform. On this Saturday, one day after the latest 2-year session had ended with no action on this bill, Representative Samuelson explained in detail what happened.
As you may know, I was the sponsor of House Bill 722, and we got up to 110 co-sponsors. That's 55% of the House. One of only 2 bills in the entire session. We had about 2,400 bills, 2,500 bills. Only 2 bills were sponsored by a majority of representatives. So with 55 sponsors, 55%, 110 sponsors, I thought, well, at least we're going to get some discussion, we're going to get some movement, we're going to get some action on this bill. As you may know, it was introduced on May 8th of 2017, and it was stuck in committee for 18 months and 22 days until it also it went away at midnight last night. We have to start again in January. We tried many different avenues to get that bill discussed. We tried to show bipartisan support across the state. We had 38 Republican co-sponsors when we were at our 110 co-sponsor level. We tried to have, we respectfully asked for a hearing. I sent a bipartisan letter to the chair of the committee. He has not answered the letter. It's been over 15 months and 14 months, and he still has not even answered a letter written by 3 of his colleagues. We tried a discharge resolution. There's a procedure where the House can try to discharge a bill out of committee over the objections of a chairperson. That was stymied twice. The chair of that committee decided to amend the bill and then hold on to it in the committee. So those bills never were released to the full House floor. So we're talking about rules because we think our rules need some amendment.
So it begs the question, if the present rules of our legislature are so bad for our democracy and need amendment, why doesn't that happen? Representative Samuelson again explains.
So we're talking about rules because we think our rules need some amendments. The new legislature gets sworn in on first Tuesday of January, and one of the first things we do traditionally is pass the House rules. And the House rules, when they're passed, govern our legislative business and our committee assignments, our parliamentary procedures for the next 2 years. 2 years ago, we got a 50-page resolution with the House rules. We got about, I'd say, 18 hours notice. I think I got this the day before. We get sworn in at noon. This was passed at 2 in the afternoon. So that was resolution number 1. But before they took up number 1, they took up number 2, which passed, which said the House rules cannot be amended. There was 132 representatives who voted not to allow amendments, and then 13 minutes later they voted for the final package. We know this is the time to talk about rules because it can affect legislation directly.
Billionaires with big interests in Pennsylvania, interests like charter school funding or fracking or public gaming, love the fact that we're one of just a few states with no ban on gifts to legislators. They love the fact that all the decisions about what gets voted on are made by a few powerful leaders because they can concentrate their contributions through those leaders, and the leaders can dole them out to those legislators who go along with the system. Even though a ban on legislative gifts has some of the strongest support of any we've researched, legislative leaders have refused to enact a gift ban session after session. Rabbi Michael Pollack, the leader of the reform group March on Harrisburg, spelled out the reality at a Fix Harrisburg press conference 2 years ago.
So I think I'm here specifically to talk about the gift ban, which is a bill that we've been working on for a few years now. And we've run into what everybody else here has run into, the same problem. I'm here to tell the truth today. And the truth is that this is not a democracy. This isn't close to a democracy. In a democracy, the majority rules. In a democracy, 50% plus one wins you a vote. But in Harrisburg, where this is not a democracy, and I see all the lobbyists walking by, I'm talking to you guys here. This is not a democracy. 6 gatekeepers manage this building. If 1 out of 253 legislators says no, then the answer is no. We have support in the House. We know we do. Out of the 203 reps, we have a vast majority in support of the gift ban. They would vote for it. We're working on it, but that's where we are. We're stuck. The state's gerrymandered. To even get on the ballot requires money. And to really win in a competitive district requires a lot of money. How do you become the House Majority Leader? You raise enough money to dole out checks to all of your colleagues. If you can't bring in over $1 million, you don't get to be a Majority Leader. And the absurdity, the frustration, is that I was just banned from the House Majority Leader's office. They brought in the whole police force. And I know they're listening. I know they can hear this. There were about a dozen police officers showed up because we were there to ask for a meeting. The nerve. A meeting to get them to call a vote on the gift ban. And while we were sitting there in the lobby, this was one of the most absurd things I've ever experienced in this building. 3 lobbyists walked past us in this building, and they have gifts in a bag. They have a bag filled with gifts, boxes, wrapped, bows on top. It's not supposed to be that literal. This place is fundamentally broken.
And here's a specific example of how gerrymandering impacts one county and a county with an important link, Westmoreland. For years now, Pennsylvania's public school boards have been petitioning the legislature to examine the formula used to determine how much money local school districts have to pay to operators of charter schools. There are 500 public school boards in Pennsylvania. 471 of them, over 94%, petitioned for action. That included all but one of the public school boards in Westmoreland County. Despite that near total call for action, nothing happened, and the problem is still not fully fixed. So why is Westmoreland a poster child for the problems in our legislature and its lack of responsiveness? Remember, this is Kim Ward's district. It includes mostly Westmoreland County. She took no action. Now Fair Districts is not advocating, one way or another, for the particular issue. We're advocating for rules that assure actions with this much support get hearings and votes. We need to know where our representatives stand. This failure is particularly problematic in rural communities where local districts are required to send more and more of their local tax dollars to charters. This is very true in Westmoreland County. In my Allegheny County hometown of Monroeville, that amount has grown over the past 15 years from $100,000 a year to $4.5 million. That's local tax money out of our public schools that we no longer have. This mandated shift has led to increased strain in local school budgets and required cuts in staff and programs. That hits particularly hard in rural districts with limited tax bases and an increasingly elderly population struggling to survive continuing tax increases. Pennsylvania is already wrestling with a state court ruling that it fails to adequately and fairly fund public education, and a recent report from the Pennsylvania Auditor General, a Republican, finds that cyber charters, despite having no bricks and mortar operations, have legally increased revenue by over $400 million between 2020 and 2023 and added to their cash reserves by 144%. Additionally, studies suggest that students graduating from these schools did less well than those in publics. But when one of the country's wealthiest men and a big investor in charter schools donates millions to Pennsylvania legislators and to similar supporters across the country, money talks, while legislators in safe districts are impervious to opposition. Fair Districts has done the work democracy demands. We're reaching out to educate and motivate Pennsylvania citizens about the problems of gerrymandering and the need for reform. We've documented over 1,800 news articles, 700 editorials and op-eds, and over 650 letters to the editor so far. We've made over 1,300 presentations like this, both live and online, to 50,000 Pennsylvanians and counting. At polling places and community events and online, we've collected over 133,000 signatures supporting redistricting and rules reform. We've gotten 389 municipal and county governing boards representing 70% of the state's population and crossing political lines to pass resolutions calling for reform. And in 2 statewide polls, 2/3 of Pennsylvanians said they support these reforms. So why is gerrymandering so damaging to our democracy? And why is Fair Districts continuing this effort after nearly 9 years of frustration? Gerrymandering means powerful legislative leaders get to choose their voters instead of you choosing them. It results in districts so heavily weighted to one party that opposition is useless, with many incumbents running unopposed, especially leaders. And that discourages public participation and breeds cynicism that causes many to drop out of the process altogether of studying candidates and voting. This is dangerous to our democracy. I've talked about the near draconian role of the rules and leadership in controlling the agenda in Harrisburg, coupled with the lack of a gift ban, a discharge procedure that's never worked, and no system of petition and referendum. The blunt fact is that unless we, the public, demand change now of our legislators, demand it so strongly that leadership can't resist the pressure from their own members, we will not get the changes we need and want for Pennsylvania. The system is a gigantic roadblock in every direction. Only sustained citizen pressure will bring the change we need. That's why each of you needs to be an agent for change. We need each of you to tell your legislators to support HB 31 and SB 131 for independent redistricting. You need to sign our petition and tell your friends and neighbors about why this issue is so important. In today's climate of political turmoil, we need a legislative process that listens to us, a process that resolves differences and finds common solutions to the critical problems facing our state, from education to healthcare to the environment, our economy, and our democracy. We won't do so as long as our system favors strife over bipartisanship. Gerrymandering is the enemy of bipartisanship. Gerrymandering may not be the issue you care about most, but it is the issue you need to care about first, because until this changes, nothing changes. Not red, not blue, just fair. Thank you.